Swift, Silent, and Deadly, Recon Marines in Vietnam, by Michael Schneider. Chapter 1, Recon's Role in the War. Imagine being one of a six-man team in the middle of a jungle where any person you might encounter might try to kill you. This is hostile territory, inhabited by an unknown number of enemy soldiers. So you could encounter one or two of them, or just as easily 50 or more. There's also the danger of man-eating tigers and poisonous snakes lurking in the jungle. Your mission is to find the enemy without them finding you. You are to report their position so that artillery batteries, bombers, or helicopter gunships can destroy the enemy without risking the lives of infantrymen in a hazardous jungle assault. You must keep quiet or you will be heard. The brush is so thick it's hard not to snap twigs or crunch brush as you move. You find a trail, but you can't walk on it because it may be booby-trapped with landmines. What sort of men are willing to undertake such a mission? These men are Reconnaissance Marines, Recon Marines for short. In the conflict between the United States and Vietnam, they played a vital role in locating and destroying the enemy. To understand why they were so special, you must know something of the Vietnam War and the environment in which it was fought. The war. Vietnam was a French colony prior to World War II. In 1940, the Japanese wrested control of the country from the French. A man named Ho Chi Minh organized an army of rebels called the Viet Minh to resist the Japanese. When the Viet Minh finally ousted the Japanese during World War II, the French sought to rule Vietnam as a colony again. When the French returned, the Viet Minh turned their efforts to drive them out also. In 1954, the communist Viet Minh finally won over the French. At that time, so many countries had fallen under the totalitarianism of communist rule. The free countries, the United States included, opposed any further expansion of communism. In addition, communists didn't believe in God and sought to repress the practice of religion. Since many Vietnamese were Catholics, those people resisted being dominated by the communist Viet Minh. For these reasons, the company became divided into North and South Vietnam, with the communists under Ho Chi Minh controlling the North and an anti-communist regime under Ngo Dinh Diem in the South. This division into two Vietnams was supposed to be a temporary situation, with both sides agreeing to elections to be held at a future date to elect leaders who would reunify the two countries. The elections never took place. Instead, the communists became more aggressive, and a group called the National Liberation Front, more commonly called the Viet Cong, formed in the South. The Viet Cong terrorized the rest of the population through murder and torture in an effort to gain control of the South. Not wanting South Vietnam to fall to the communists, the United States decided to support the anti-communist forces in their fight against the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army. At first, we only sent advisors to help train the South Vietnamese Army. By 1965, however, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, or ARVN, was still too weak to resist the extremely aggressive communist forces. The United States government decided it would take a major commitment of combat troops to help liberate South Vietnam from the scourge of the communists. In March of 1965, the first Marines arrived in Vietnam. By 1969, the number of Marines in Vietnam reached its maximum. The Marine commander of 3 Marine amphibious force was responsible for the defense of the Republic of Vietnam's South Vietnam, 5 northernmost provinces. This included the 1st and the 3rd Marine Divisions, the 1st Marine Aircraft Wing, numerous other smaller Marine combat and support units, and some U.S. Army units. This area was known as I Corps, Tactical Zone, usually just called I Corps. Reconnaissance units provided the information the Marine generals needed to plan successful combat operations against the Communist forces in these provinces of I Corps. The enemy. The enemy the Marines faced was composed of two main groups. The first was the Viet Cong, also known as the VC. These were fighters that were not regular soldiers. They often lived among the other people in villages and cities of Vietnam. They would gather together at night or in remote areas to prepare for attack on American or ARVN forces. The VC were predominantly South Vietnamese communists. The second group was the North Vietnamese Army, or NVA. These were regular Army troops from North Vietnam, sent south to assist the Viet Cong in taking control of South Vietnam. They would infiltrate South Vietnam. That is, when the NVA came down from the north, they would stick to the jungle or remote areas where their movement would not likely be noticed. Both the VC and NVA engaged primarily in guerrilla warfare. This means they usually would strike a target, for example, a village or a city, then retreat back into the jungle or blend in with the rest of the population where they wouldn't be noticed. The Americans, generally used to fighting battles on a large scale, had a difficult time fighting this elusive enemy. Weapons and tactics. The U.S. Marines are generally assault forces. Traditionally, they traveled aboard Navy ships where they could be sent ashore to deal with trouble Americans might have with foreign nations. During World War II, they fought almost exclusively in the Pacific theater of the war. In this war, they perfected the technique of the amphibious landing, which is landing on the beach from the sea and moving inland to defeat the enemy and take control of an island. Vietnam, however, provided a different challenge. While the Marines made some amphibious landings, they didn't engage the enemy on the beach. In fact, when the Marines first landed in northern South Vietnam in 1965, their mission was primarily to defend critical areas, airfields for instance, against attack by the VCA or NVA. As more Marines arrived in South Vietnam, they took on a more offensive role. The northern part of South Vietnam contains a lot of jungle-covered mountains. The Marines soon learned that the most efficient way to transport troops from a base camp to an area where the enemy had been spotted was by helicopter. Although a variety of helicopters were used, those used most often were cargo helicopters and gunships. Cargo helicopters ferried both troops and supplies from one place to another. An example is the CH-46, which has a large tube-shaped body with rotors on both the front and the rear. Near the front, machine guns are mounted on both sides, where machine gunners on the crew can provide covering fire if the troops being transported needed to be rescued from a battle in the field. The gunship is a helicopter specially designed to attack the enemy. An example is the Cobra. It carries a crew of 2 and delivers a stream of bullets from its machine guns or grenades from its grenade launcher. The gunships usually accompanied the cargo helicopters when the trip involved entering an area where the cargo helicopters might draw enemy fire. Artillery played an important role also. The big guns were placed at various locations within the Marines' area of responsibility where they could support troops engaged with the enemy in the field. These locations were called fire support bases. Air support was available also. Jets from an aircraft carrier or from an air base in South Vietnam flew missions in support of the ground forces, often delivering bombs or napalm, a chemical which can spread and burn a large area. At times, long-range bombers would fly missions to South Vietnam from Okinawa and deliver heavy bombardment known as arc light. Since the hit-and-run tactics used by the Communist forces rarely resulted in major battles, The Marines usually had to look for the enemy. Infantry units would sweep through an area, trying to find enemy soldiers and destroy any weapons or supplies the enemy might have stashed away. In order to make these operations more successful, Marine leaders used a specially trained group of Marines called Reconnaissance Marines. Mission of the Recon Marine. The main mission of the Reconnaissance Marines was to locate the enemy and their base camps. Within the jungles of Vietnam, the VC and NVA had developed an intricate system of trails and supply points to keep themselves supplied with weapons, ammunition, food, and other items needed to conduct a war. Reconnaissance Marines searched for these places where the enemy forces might be concentrated and reported their locations back to headquarters, where the decision would be made whether to attack with infantry troops, artillery, airstrikes, or some combination of the three. Often the Recon Marines, who were to be swift, silent, and deadly, would run into or be discovered by the enemy. Such an encounter was called making contact. The Marines would then have to fight off the enemy while trying to escape being overwhelmed. Sometimes Recon Marines would conduct raids themselves, but this was not their primary mission. More commonly, they would call in artillery or airstrikes on the targets when they discovered them in the bush. Training. Recon Marines started with the same basic training as other U.S. Marines. As a result of basic training, all Marines became proficient in the use of their primary weapon, the rifle. It is often quoted, the deadliest animal on earth is a Marine rifleman. Most commonly, this rifle was the M14 or M16. The M16 replaced the M14 as the weapon generally used during the later years of the war. Recon Marines, however, received training unique to their task. First, of course, is physical training. In the field, a Recon Marine would have to carry heavy packs and other personal gear over rough terrain in unbearable heat. Running 3 miles or more on a daily basis was the core of the Recon Marines training. Information was the main product of a reconnaissance mission. For this reason, a lot of training focused on the gathering and communicating of information. Instructors taught classes on reporting procedures, what to look for in the handling of captured documents and equipment, how to communicate over the radio, how to care for the radio, how to care for and use cameras. Typically, a reconnaissance patrol was composed of 7 men. One of these was a Navy corpsman who was specially trained in emergency medical procedures to assist a wounded or injured Marine. However, in the event something happened to the corpsman, each Marine had to know some basic first aid. A Recon Marines training included this. The Recon Marine also had to be trained in what to look for in the handling of captured documents and equipment. Often important information could be deduced about the enemy from the things the enemy was carrying. Another important skill was map reading. If you didn't know where you were, it would be virtually impossible for the helicopters to find you and pull you out of the bush. Skill in map reading also had other important consequences. One could avoid being trapped on a cliff or otherwise forced into some terrain where the enemy had the advantage. In addition, knowing where one was allowed you to call the artillery battery and they could shoot rounds to help fight off the enemy. One of the actual fun parts of the training was repelling. This involved jumping from a high place to the ground while using a rope to keep from falling too fast. 2 types of repelling were important. The first was repelling from a cliff. To practice this, a Recon Marine would jump off a 30-foot tower. The other kind was repelling from a helicopter. In a way, this was much easier. The reason is that you didn't have to worry about hitting anything on the way down. Marines typically learned repelling from a CH-46 Sea Knight helicopter. It had a square hole in the bottom of the fuselage known as the hell hole. The CH-46 also had a back ramp, which Marines could also repel. Repelling was a quick way to get recon team to the ground when the helicopter could not find a suitable place to land. Another fun part of the training was the rubber boat drills. Since it was not uncommon that Recon Marines might be launched on a mission from submarines, the Marines had to know how to handle a rubber boat. In the rubber boats, the Marines learned how to paddle in a coordinated manner and how to deal with the boat capsizing. When the boat capsized, the Marines learned how to empty the water from it and to set it up right again. These were called broaching drills. As you might guess, being able to swim is a valuable and necessary skill for a Recon Marine. Tactics. Since a Marine recon team was not an offensive unit, the tactics they learned were mainly those needed to avoid detection and how to react when encountering the enemy. Some of the things the Marines would do to avoid detection included staying off traveled trails, avoid talking out loud, and burying or packing out any trash from their rations. The reconnaissance Marine also trained in patrolling techniques. One of the skills he had to learn was how to react when a patrol made contact with the enemy. A Recon Marine could expect to practice immediate action, or IA drills. And in IA drills, each member of the team practices what moves to make if the team encounters the enemy. Normally the team forms a circle, which they called a 360, after the number of degrees in a circle. The Marine closest to the enemy would fire a magazine of ammunition at the enemy, then run through the circle, stop, and reload. The Marine second closest to the enemy would then fire a magazine and follow the first. The remaining team members followed in turn. By the time all had done so, they would have formed a new 360, ready to repeat if necessary. At this time, the team leader would order what action to take next. A recon team would practice these drills over and over until they became a reflexive action. The drills included what to do if being attacked from the front, rear, or the flanks. Since it is important for a Recon Marine to work and rely on an artillery battery, he also received training on being a forward observer. A forward observer is one who spots an enemy target and tells the men firing the big guns how to hit the target. Normally the artillery unit may be miles away from the target and you can't see it. The forward observer gives position, map coordinates, to the battery as well as the position of the enemy target. One of the big guns will fire a round at the target. The forward observer then tells the battery where the round landed and recommends a correction at aiming the big guns. This way, the artillery battery can zero in on the target until they hit it. To learn how to do this, the Recon Marine receives training on the capabilities of the artillery guns. Then he practices by calling in rounds on a practice target. To complete training, the Recon Marine goes on a practice patrol to put all this training to use. In Vietnam, there was a special place where newly arrived Recon Marines from the United States could practice their patrolling techniques. This place was Monkey Mountain. Here the vegetation was so dense and difficult to move through that it might take a half a day for a team to move 1,000 yards. Weapons. A Recon Marine learned to use a variety of weapons. Nearest and dearest to his heart was his rifle. All Marines are first and foremost riflemen. Recon Marines were certainly no exception. The M14 and M16 rifles were the weapons carried by the individual team members. Generally, the M16 replaced the M14 as the standard rifle in Vietnam because of its lighter weight. The M16 fired a 5.52 millimeter bullet. It could be fired semi-automatic or fully automatic. The M14, on the other hand, normally was fired only as a semi-automatic weapon. It could, however, be converted to an automatic weapon. The M14 fired a 7.62 millimeter bullet. This heavier bullet was more likely to stop VC or NVA soldier in his path immediately, so some Marines, particularly those who had to walk point or the lead position on a patrol, preferred to carry the M14. The M14 was also easier to take apart and clean if it got dirty or a round stuck in the chamber. All the Marines on a team carried grenades. Most of these were HE, or high explosive grenades. They were round in shape and had a short delay before exploding. When thrown at the enemy, the subsequent explosion would hurl bits of metal called shrapnel at the enemy soldiers. Claymore mines were another weapon carried by the recon team. These consisted of a bunch of little projectiles. They looked like BBs used in a BB gun, backed by C4 plastic explosive. Normally, the team set out the mines to protect their positions or harbor site at night. In the morning, they would retrieve the mines again. In the event of an enemy attack, the mines would explode when a Marine closed a remote switch. Usually, one member of a recon team also carried an M79 grenade launcher. This weapon, commonly called the blooper, fired bullet-shaped grenades, 40 millimeters in diameter. It got its pet name from the sound it made when it was fired. It looked like a sawed-off shotgun of large diameter. Marines were also trained to use the M60 machine gun, although it wasn't normally carried on patrol. This was commonly used as a defensive weapon on observation posts, OPs, which the Recon Marines guarded. Other special equipment. In addition to the weapons, Recon Marines were trained to use other special equipment. One of these was C4 plastic explosive. A common use of this explosive was to clear trees or shrubs from an LZ, landing zone. It was a white substance, moldable as clay and thus very practical. The Starlight scope was another useful tool. While not normally carried on patrol, it would more likely be used when a recon team was assigned to a listening post near an OP or some other defensive perimeter. This scope allowed the viewer to see things at night that would normally not be visible. Although the screen appeared in a monochrome of green and yellowish white, one could clearly distinguish individual objects, for example, snakes in the dark. To remove a team from the bush when a helicopter landing wasn't possible, two methods were used. The first of these was the extract ladder. This was a flexible ladder composed of aluminum rungs. It could be rolled up and carried on a helicopter. When the helicopter reached the location of the team to be extracted, the ladder was unfurled from the helicopter and the team climbed aboard it. Once all the team was on the helicopter, it would take off with the team dangling on the ladder below. The extract ladder, approximately 100 feet long, unfurled, was still cumbersome to use. It was replaced by the special insertion/extraction or SPIE rig. The SPIE rig looked like a long rope with metal D-shaped rings embedded in it at intervals of about 5 feet apart. There were enough of these links that each member of a complete recon team could attach themselves to the rig. For this purpose, each member of the team wore a special harness that also had a snap link shaped like a D, which could quickly be linked to one of the links on the SPIE rig. To perform an extraction, the crew on the helicopter only had to lower the rig under the helicopter low enough so the team on the ground could link to it. The helicopter would then climb to a suitable altitude with the team dangling below. When arriving back at the base, the helicopter would slowly descend, allowing the team members to touch the ground and unhook themselves from the rig. Of course, the recon team depended on the radio. Most commonly, this was the PRC-25. The team carried 2 of these. If one failed, the other served as a backup. They were carried as a backpack. The primary radio man carried one. Another member of the team carried the other one. The primary radio operator carried codes called shackle sheets. Any information that could be useful to the enemy, he translated into code before sending it. All members of the team could operate the radio in an emergency, but the primary operator had received special training and was more proficient at the job. The team. During the course of the Vietnam War, the Marine Corps varied the number and composition of the members on the team. The most common, however, was the 7-man team composed of a point man, patrol leader, radio operator, corpsman, second radio man, assistant patrol leader, and tail man. These positions are listed in the normal order of march. The team walked single file, with each member staying about 25 yards apart from the person in front and the person in back of him. This was necessary to minimize the damage enemy landmines or booby-traps might cause if a team member accidentally set one off. The distance would reduce the likelihood that a second team member would be seriously injured or killed. Nevertheless, each team member kept the man in front of and behind him in view. This was important because a team member would not want to get separated from the rest of the team. In addition, team members communicated with each other with hand signals so they would not give away their position by talking. An officer or a non-commissioned officer served as a team leader. The team leader typically had a lot of experience from past patrols. The point man always went first. The team leader didn't walk point because the point man would be the one most likely to encounter the enemy first and had the greatest risk of being shot. It was important that the team leader be able to direct the team if contact was made with the enemy. The team leader walked in the second position. This put him in view of the point position and close to his primary radio man. The functions of the corpsman and primary radio man were discussed above. The assistant team leader and secondary radio man served as backups to the primary positions and as additional riflemen if the team encountered trouble. The most important function performed by the man in the rear was to look for signs of being followed. A really good rear guard would almost walk backwards the whole patrol.